We're all good to go. Thank you for being here. My name is Kai Swanson, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this third installment of our 25th Frieze Lectures, which is extraordinary to me to think about. And today we get to learn something that for many of us will be a lot of new territory, for me at least. I don't know about the rest of you. But if you have heard the name Humboldt, you probably most recently heard it in 2019 when Humboldt Park in Chicago was home to a rogue alligator that someone let loose as a pet and was recovered safely, 5 feet 3 inches of alligator. And I do think that the subject of today's talk would have been quite amused to know that an alligator had shown up near the shores of Lake Michigan. Our speaker today, who's going to introduce us to Alexander von Humboldt, is, well, let me just put it this way. Some jobs at Augustana College are a lot cooler than some other jobs at Augustana College. And I don't know anyone who's got a cooler gig than our speaker today. Dr. Stephen Hager, in addition to being a professor in our Department of Biology, is also director of our field stations. And many Quad citizens might be aware of the 115 acres down 7th Avenue, but they may not know that the college also has hundreds of acres elsewhere. The Beeling Ecological Preserve, which is just on the other side of Trinity Unity Point Moline, on the shores of the Rock River. Also, there is the Green Wing Conservancy, it's somewhat east of here, not far from Amboy, Illinois. And my personal favorite, the Collinson Preserve, which is near the Collinson Quarries in Milan, which is home to, among other things, an extremely rare micro-ecosystem called a hill prairie. Now that would be a great subject for another Frieze lecture, so mark it in your calendar, Dr. Hager. We'll get you back here. But today we're going to talk about Alexander von Humboldt. Many of us know about Darwin, but there's a very open question as to whether or not Darwin would have had the impact that Darwin had if Darwin hadn't been impacted by Alexander von Humboldt. We're going to learn more about that now. Our speaker today did his undergraduate and master's degree at Cal State Fullerton, where he actually was focused on lizards. And then he went and got a PhD at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, also about lizards. But much of his publishing since then has been about birds and about how birds interact with our human-built environment. Not always a happy story, but we can learn ways to make our built environment more friendly to birds. So this is a polymath that I think Humboldt himself would have appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Hager.
Good afternoon, everybody. Maybe I should have named this talk The Rogue Alligator. The picture of nature thus drawn, notwithstanding the want of distinctness of some of its outlines, will not be the less able to enrich the intellect, enlarge the sphere of ideas, and nourish and vivify the imagination. To Humboldt, one rule of the natural world was dynamic change. Maybe the most basic life form, a species, is not an isolated fixed entity, but rather is part of the whole system, linked to both past and future. In Cosmos, he would write of circles of commotion and cyclical change, transitions and perpetual renewal. These phrases, vivifying the imagination and circles of commotion, struck me as poetic and profoundly apt in my relationship with the natural world, and strikingly coincidental with other stuff that I read. For example, John Michael Greer, one of my favorite authors, writes repeatedly about the role of imagination in helping one live a life fulfilled in service to the natural world. What I'm presenting today is a short collection of photographs and stories that might be best summarized as exploring my relationship with the natural world, inspired by Humboldt's Cosmos and other sources. The material is all mine unless otherwise noted, and in the case of the history and interpretations of Humboldt's life, I've borrowed from Andrea Wolf's magnificent work, The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World, published in 2015 by Vintage Books. This is Sally. I have two guides or guiding metaphors for this exploration, my relationship with the natural world. The first one is the Tibetan mandala. Quoting from another one of my favorite authors, David George Haskell, the mandala is a recreation of the path of life, the cosmos, and the enlightenment of Buddha, and has significance at many levels. The concentration required for its creation, the balance between its complexity and coherence, the symbols embedded in its design, and its impermanence. The whole universe is seen through the mandala. The second is Humboldt's Cosmos, and in particular, what really is a data table that he published in one of his publications that might be best summarized by another author who wrote a journal article about Humboldt's expression in his imagery. And Jackson writes, Humboldt shows the tension between the material world of nature, individual organisms, species, communities, and ecosystems, and the internal world of human sensations, perceptions, and emotions which connect us to the natural world. He believed that knowing the world intellectually and emotionally strengthens our bonds with nature and humanity. Humboldt was infamous, captivating, and inspiring during his time, probably second only to Napoleon. Born into a life of privilege, but he rejected the easy, comfortable life. He worked obsessively to try to understand how the natural world operated. He traveled to numerous places outside of Europe in this quest, conducting experiments and collecting specimens. While in Ecuador, he was the first to climb to the top of Mount Chimborazo. The peak was profoundly inspirational to him, and it came to represent a new way of thinking about the Earth, seeing it as one giant organism. The mountain that is depicted in this graphic is supposed to be Mount Chimborazo. He believed that the information he generated from his observations and experiments were open source. That's to say that all of his work wasn't like his own property and under his control and managed under his control. He viewed it as public information. He was something of a brute and did much of his scientific work in the most remote and hostile places, and often pushed his body to the limits. A complete sense of wonder might describe how he approached his studies. Nature had to be experienced through feelings. He may have had a photographic memory which allowed him to assess and make fundamental world-changing connections between observations and facts, separated by great distances in time. He was a visionary with hypotheses and inventions that were way ahead of the times. Vegetation zones, isotherms. He discovered the magnetic equator and revolutionized the way we view the natural world. Nothing could be viewed and understood on its own terms. True knowledge could only be gained by understanding the network of relations among things and what he called the great chain of causes and effects and web of life. This web metaphor has profound fundamental implications for the resistance and resiliency of life in the face of never-ending, constant change. And he was the first to discuss climate change resulting from the actions of humans. The inspiration from Cosmos came from a lifetime of studying and feeling the natural world. Two adventures, one to the Americas in the late 1700s and another to Asia in the early 1800s, were particularly influential. This is a map showing his travels in the late 1700s to the Americas, first stopping in the Canary Islands and then spending almost the rest of the time in the northern part of what is now South America, and then heading up to Mexico, to Cuba, and then to the United States, and then back home again. He interacted extensively with other scientists, artists, and historians. And so many experiments led to a series of lectures in Berlin, which then led to the idea of wanting to bring it all together into a book he would come to call Cosmos, And cosmos translated into English, you might think of as the universe seen as an ordered whole. Cosmos represented the most current understanding of the natural world, including the human dimension with history, politics, art, and culture. In the early to mid-1800s, specific branches of science had emerged with boundaries that delineated disciplines and reduced interactions among scientists across those different disciplines. Cosmos attempted to blur those boundaries and ended up representing a collaboration between Humboldt and scientists, historians, poets, etc., about the most contemporary understanding of the earth and the heavens. The first volume was published in 1845. It took 10 years to complete, and it took readers on a journey through the heavens across the earth into geology, geography, the nature of organic life, entangled in a complicated web of interactions and reciprocity. The second volume was published in 1847 and surveyed humanity from the past to the present, and the feeling and the human interactions with the natural world for understanding and feeling. Whereas most, if not all, of science attempted to objectify the natural world, that's to say, for instance, by describing species, dynamic geology, etc., Humboldt argued for a more holistic and subjectified approach. A couple more volumes were published before and after his death. Humboldt struck up a lifetime friendship and engaged in many professional collaborations with the famous poet Goethe, and influenced and solidified Humboldt's belief and understanding of the natural world through both material and spiritual ways. For example, Goethe wrote that opposite colors are those that reciprocally evoke each other in the eye, for instance, violet and yellow, and stimulate feelings of beauty and delight. And what I have here is just a graphic of the color wheel showing those opposite colors that I just described and what Goethe also described. There are probably relevant ecological and evolutionary reasons for that reciprocal relationship of viewing these two colors together. For example, pollinators could be attracted more better to these flowers for pollination, and then pollinators would get a meal. In an evolutionary sense, the flowers of opposite colors would get more flowers pollinated, and the pollinators would see those pollinators that did see those color relations would get more food that increased fitness of the individual and or the colony. Why are yellow and violet asters so beautiful together? Is it a phenomenon? It is a phenomenon that might be both material and spiritual. That is, science, that's to say mind and maybe body, and traditional knowledge, body and spirit. Humboldt's publications and lectures were enormously influential during his life, and I believe that influence continues directly and indirectly today. So for example, I have a bulleted list here of some of the folks that you might have heard of before who were directly influenced, indirectly influenced. Thomas Jefferson, as Kai said, Charles Darwin may not have had the impact that he did if it wasn't for Humboldt. Darwin idolized Humboldt and wanted, like so many, to follow in Humboldt's footsteps and to go on adventures and discover things about the natural world. Wordsworth incorporated the concept of nature in his poetry. Goethe, spending a few days with Humboldt was like living several years, having lived several years. Thoreau weaved natural history and poetry into new ideas, and Walden may have been a very different book without him. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring as an indirect influence, Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. Humboldt's views and discoveries and inventions were so self-evident that we have forgotten that he was the one who came up with them all. So one of the main points of today's talk is Humboldt's influence on people. So I want to transition to someone who I idolize as well, who was extremely influenced by Humboldt, and that was Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel was a German zoologist, naturalist, philosopher, physician, professor, marine biologist, and artist. He struggled with trying to understand the natural world with either the paintbrush or the microscope. His favorite animal, the jellyfish, was, he discovered that the jellyfish was one of his favorite animals after spending time in the North Sea swimming every day and catching things. Here's a photo of that jellyfish. Not a photo, but an illustration of that jellyfish. He really loved the transparent body of the organism, rimmed and streaked with various colors. As a young man and university student, Haeckel was so enamored and inspired by Humboldt's writings and life that he too wanted to travel to South America and follow in Humboldt's footsteps. He reasoned that this would allow him to reconcile the two souls in his body, the man of reason and the artist ruled by feeling and poetry. Haeckel's professional life started in Italy, studying marine life, and with a microscope and paintbrush, wowed the scientific and artistic worlds with never before seen marine life that he would end up describing and painting, especially the radiolarians. Haeckel moved Humboldt's concept of nature into the 20th century. So for me, the Tibetan mandala and Humboldt's cosmos and nature paintings continue to be important guideposts that I follow nearly all the time. Again, one of my favorite authors, John Michael Greer, published his content on a weekly blog at ecosophia.net. He wrote recently, "Our culture tries to draw a hard line between the material world, which we think of as real, objective, and out there, and the world of dream and trance and vision, which we think of as unreal, subjective, and all in your head. That division is very familiar and very comforting, and is a good enough generalization for practical purposes that people can go through their entire lives without noticing the places where it breaks down, where what seems to be out there actually belongs to the realm of consciousness, and what seems to be all in your head got there by way of the efforts of another mind. Thoughts and feelings that arise in me offer guidance about where to walk, what to photograph, what to study and explore in more detail." My friend Bo Jadek found it. He was thrilled with the discovery and humbled by its life. It was a sycamore tree at one of Augie's field stations that Kai had mentioned in his introduction, at Collinson Ecological Preserve just down the road in Milan, Illinois, which I'll talk more about later actually. But this sycamore was different and special. The growth pattern of the tree was unlike any other sycamore he'd seen before. Half of it was laying on the ground and still alive on a steep slope that was part of the bluffs of Mill Creek, a tributary of the Mississippi. He studied it for a while to try to figure out why its growth pattern was so unique. And I believe the story he came up with makes a lot of sense, and I'd like to share that with you right now. So here's the way I feel and see the sycamore tree. We call it survivor sycamore. Bo named it that. Here's another view of it. I had to get a fisheye lens, wide angle lens, just to capture it all because of the weird growth pattern, because it's more horizontal than it is vertical. Here you can see my cursor up there? I can't see my cursor up there, can you?
Up in the corner.
Up in the corner.
Oh, keep moving. There it is.
There it is. Oh, you didn't want to go there? That's a normal sycamore. Okay, back to the survivor sycamore. Anyway, right along this axis here is the part that's laying on the ground, and then there's this part right here that is the main trunk of the tree. Here's the normal sycamore. This is the one right across the street from my house. You've seen normal sycamores before. So what I'd like to do for you is illustrate for you with some awesome illustrations, my own illustrations of the story that Bo came up with on how this tree came to be. First awesome illustration. Side view of the bluffs of Mill Creek. So here is the slope right here, and here is the sycamore tree growing before it became lying on the ground. So regular sycamore with regular roots in the ground, in regular soil on a regular slope. Then a windstorm came, blew the sycamore down on its side. Tree is still alive, but now the tree is faced with the problem, and these plants have evolved ways of resiliency and adapting to things that happen like this. And I'll get to that in just a second, but what happened after that, according to Bo's story, is one of those stems that was part of the main trunk of the tree started growing vertical. Had to compete with all the rest of the trees in that particular location for access to sunlight, because without the sunlight, there's no photosynthesis and no life. So one of those branches came to life, started growing, as well as part of the main trunk of the tree that was laying on the ground started growing roots. And that's what we basically see today in Survivor Sycamore. So I'd like to just combine a little bit of this storytelling with a little bit of science. How did this happen? All plants, like the sycamore tree, have these axillary buds, which are responding to gravity, they're responding to light, they're responding to so many things. So when the sycamore was blown down on its side, basically it was asking itself the question, which of these stems is going to become the trunk that's going to keep us alive? It's going to grow to be the new trunk to get some access and compete, access to sunlight and compete with all the other trees in the area. There are plant hormones that are actively working to make that decision, help make that decision. Cytokinin and auxin are both plant hormones that stimulate growth, but growth in only like the best way possible in the context of this thing called apical dominance, or part of the plant that kind of assumes the main role of large growth, especially as it relates to getting high in the canopy and getting access to sunlight. So there's the sycamore before it was blown down, then it was blown down, then the tree trunk started growing roots. How does that work? There are receptors, and this is a side view of the trunk of the tree, and if you blow that up, there are receptors on the edge of the tree, even though it looks like dead bark, that are actually actively assessing the situation. The tree found itself down on dirt, and so these receptors are sending out all kinds of signals to the tree, and cytokinins and auxins are all participating in helping to grow roots, and that's exactly what started happening to the tree there. So Survivor Sycamore, here's another way I like to view Survivor Sycamore. And I also want to share with you a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer in her recent award-winning book that some of you might have read, Braiding Sweetgrass. Kimmerer said, "Indigenous herbalists advise to pay attention when plants come to you. They're bringing you something that you need to learn." And that's what my friend Bo did, and he shared this story and tree with me. I wanted to honor him by making environmental portraits of him out there with Survivor Sycamore, and let him tell me more of the details of the tree and his relationship with it. So here's Bo. Maybe you know Bo. If you know Bo, this is kind of what you see all the time, a very fun-loving, jovial guy. But boy, when he starts talking biology, and especially botany, serious. But here's Bo, and I tried to capture his essence, especially with the tree. So both of us are out at Collinson with Survivor Sycamore. And there he is telling me about the growth pattern, how he thinks this tree came to be, showing me the roots that grew in what was the main trunk of the tree that got blown down on the side of the slope. In 1931, Fabian Andre, Wilbur Schwant, and Gus Kahn fused lyrics and music to a song titled "Dream a Little Dream of Me." Have you heard of this song? I bet you have. I'd just like to share with you a verse from that. "Stars shining bright above you, night breezes seem to whisper I love you, birds singing in the sycamore tree, dream a little dream of me." I'd like to share with you a poem that I wrote out at Sycamore Tree sometime later after Bo and I met up. I sat down next to the Survivor Sycamore and took a sip of water and saw the oysters fruiting. A tufted titmouse, rather irritated with me, chided "Pleep suey" over and over again. Another distant titmouse was harmonizing with the forest, buzzing riffs on a steady breeze. The music made those tree tulips perfect for 3 baby robins, and I stood up to broadcast Virginia Rye for the fire. I actually had a tufted titmouse vocalization to play for you all, but the audio wasn't great, and I'm not good enough to replicate it with my own vocal repertoire. So anyway, I'm going to transition to the tufted titmouse, and you have to imagine it's vocalizing, pleep suey, pleep suey. But I was out at Survivor Sycamore hearing this bird, and I didn't know it was a tufted titmouse. It was early in spring, therefore spring migration. I thought it was a bird migrating from the south singing, and it wasn't. It was a tufted titmouse. It made me wonder. I didn't recognize that call, and I've been around tufted titmice since I moved here from chasing lizards in Las Cruces, Illinois, back in the late 1990s. And I've been around titmice for over 20 years. I've never heard that call before. So I wondered, what other kind of calls do people know about this bird? So I got into the literature, and this species account suggests that there are some, 35 different calls and songs that this bird makes. The first 12 that are listed here are all calls: contact calls, chickadee calls, seep calls, raspy jouet, chi sui, zeep, melodious ti pleur used in combat, and those are just the calls. Then it's possible that the males sing during the breeding season up to 20 different song types. So that was pretty interesting to me. Then I started wondering, I do a fair amount of birding in the area, in the region, northwestern Illinois, and I don't see tufted titmice all that often, to be honest with you. They're very common at Collinson, our field station. I've been hearing one occasionally at Augustana on campus, but they're just really not that common, at least in my experience. So I wanted to understand more about their relative abundance, in the region. Here is a graphic that shows the range of the bird, of the species, and you can see it occurs throughout all of eastern United States. But then I wanted to zoom in on just our part of the world and look at some bird observation reports from other birders seeing this bird. And you can see from this aerial photograph map, every little flag that you see here, whether it's red or blue, represents an observation of the tufted titmouse. Oops. Tufted titmouse found all in those flagged areas, but not here. Why aren't they found there? Not here. Why aren't they found there? So I wanted to learn more about that, and I got into the literature. And it's possible that the tufted titmouse is what's referred to as a keystone information provider to other forest-dwelling birds. That's to say, it's possible that this bird is only found in areas of very high-quality habitat, so it's an indicator of that, and it's possible that other songbird species are eavesdropping on the tufted titmouse and selecting those locations just by virtue of the titmouse being there. So this keystone information provider hypothesis is related to habitat selection and keystone species. So what is habitat selection? Habitat selection is decision making about habitat quality. That's to say adequate food, suitable mates, the best nesting sites, etc., that ultimately affects fitness, that's to say survival and reproduction of the species. What information is used in decision making for habitat selection? Personal experience, that's, for example, breeding success in previous breeding seasons, as well as social experience, observing the behaviors and the decisions made by other individuals of the same species or of different species. What's a keystone species? A keystone species is a species whose presence in ecosystems is essential to maintaining the organization and diversity of communities. So for example, woodpeckers are considered a keystone species in forest ecosystems because they provide cavities for many secondary cavity nesting species. They interact with wood-rotting fungi as its dispersal vectors. The tufted titmouse and its close relative, the black-capped chickadee, may be a species that provides direct or indirect information to other species related to habitat quality. Here's an example of within a species with the yellow-breasted chat. During migration, yellow-breasted chats are coming, for instance, in the spring from south to north. They're not going from, for instance, South Texas to Northern Illinois in one flyover. They're actually going over numerous days and making numerous stops along the way to refuel and rest. Those individuals that are nesting and refueling in particular places are vocalizing, and so migrating yellow-breasted chats that are above those places are listening to that and falling down and selecting those habitats based on other members of chat being there as well. Here's an example of different species and habitat selection. Willow warbler and chaffinch. Here's willow warbler, and here's a chaffinch. Oops. Are known to use social cues from the willow tit that you see right here that looks like our black-capped chickadee. So these are European species. Willow tit and the great tit for nesting site selection and sites for winter feeding. So songbirds may use information provided by titmice as cues in habitat selection and make decisions at various scales, for example, at the landscape scale, to select a habitat patch, or at a smaller scale when choosing a nest location. Species using cues of titmice, for example, in the habitat selection process may affect their spatial distribution, and so the titmouse may be an important signaler of habitat quality. I love to imagine what the Earth was like 1 billion years ago, before the evolution of vascular land plants. Life was teeming with bacteria, protists, algae, and some simple multicellular life forms, not just the land plants we know today. What were those organisms that were around back then that most probably transformed part of the Earth to create the stuff as fundamental as soil that would be so important to the evolution of land plants? One hypothesis suggests very strongly that lichens may have been some of those organisms that provided soil for those early land plants. What is a lichen? Lichens are familiar sights in many environments, often forming colorful growths on rocks or tree trunks. Lichens are stable associations between a fungus and a photosynthetic microorganism, usually a green algae or a cyanobacterium. Lichens consist mostly of fungal hyphae. The photosynthetic algae or cyanobacteria form a thin layer just underneath the surface. Lichens cover an estimated 8% of the Earth's surface. The hyphae anchor the lichen to a rock or tree, aiding the uptake and retention of water and nutrients, and produce chemicals that protect against excess light and herbivores. The photosynthetic partners provide a source of food such as carbohydrates. The two partners exchange nutrients through the fungal hyphae that tightly encircle or even penetrate the walls of the photosynthetic cells. Lichens in harsh environments grow very slowly and have a high tolerance for desiccation and can tolerate wide fluctuations in temperature and light. Lichens physically break up rock by growth and by chemicals excreted and when they die. Their bodies form organic matter that, when combined with dissolved rock, becomes soil. Thus, they form the boundary between inorganic, inanimate physical substances and organic life. Lichens are able to thrive in places where neither partner could exist on their own. By the way, this is another plate from Hager. What I'd like to do is share with you a brief summary of a newly published paper on lichens and how different and variable they actually are in just the fungal and photosynthetic partners making a new species. And so the graphic that I have right here, this blob, kind of an ugly blob, is a lichen. And it's trying to represent all the different things that we now know are present in a lichen. Like I said before, definitely the fungus is there, definitely the photosynthetic partner is there, but what we now know based on this new paper is that there's always a lot of bacteria in there as well. Bacteria that are actively participating in the functioning of the whole ecosystem, this small little tiny ecosystem. Some bacteria aren't participating in reciprocity, they're not giving back, they're taking from what the fungus and the photosynthetic partner is doing, but they're not making things bad. There's always some kind of animal in there, microscopic animal like water bears and small nematode worms. And there are always other kinds of fungi that are hanging out in either okay ways or not entirely bad ways. Some could be parasitic as well, though. So we now know that lichens are way more than just the two symbionts that I mentioned to you before. So they go on to say and argue for how we need to start thinking about lichens where they occur. Lichens can be highly variable, and that's what this next graphic I'm going to try to explain for you is supposed to represent. So there's that blob again, but it has some symbols on there. This is a lichen. You can think of it as one species of lichen. And then there are two data tables, if you would just bear with me here. This table right here, simple table, is showing you the possibilities for the different types of fungi that can be present within the lichen. And so the species, the different species, possible species, are shown for you in rows. So here's one species, here's another species, here's another species. But within a species, there could be variation among individuals, and that's what the genotype thing is saying. So even though this particular species of fungus may be present in this lichen, there could be different genotypes that increase the diversity within there. Also, with regard to the photosynthetic symbionts, that's what this table is representing, the algal symbionts. The data table is simply the same. Across the rows are the different possible species, and in the columns are the different genotypes or different varieties within a species that could be present. So if you just look at the blob and all the symbolism that's shown there for you with the different photosynthetic symbionts and fungi, I think you can visually see how quite diverse this one individual of one lichen species could be, as well as different species of bacteria that are kind of hard to see in the graphic I'm showing you. So what the authors are suggesting is, within one lichen species in a forest, for instance, you can have enormous amounts of variation of individuals. And look at just the color symbols across all these different individuals of the same lichen species within a particular area. Allen and Lendemer argue we need to rethink what we know about lichens, because they can aid in conservation and serve as model systems for how to understand and scale up to big ecosystems like forest ecosystems in the Midwest. Lots of variation within a species, and now extrapolate that to all the different lichen species that can be present in a particular area, and all the different variation within those species. There could be tons of variation. Lichens challenge our concept of identity and force us to question where one organism stops and another one begins. The lichening rod effect, a phrase coined by Trevor Goward, who's the curator of lichen collection at the University of British Columbia, and elaborated on by Merlin Sheldrake in his new book, Entangled Life. Basically, the lichening rod effect is used to describe extreme tolerances of lichens, and to me, the new evidence showing how complex and diverse lichens are. Sheldrake says, the lichening rod effect is what happens when a lichening bolt hits familiar concepts and splinters them into new forms. Or, the lichening effect is what happens when one truly sees and understands lichens for what they are, and then realizes that what we thought we knew about the natural world needs to be upgraded for a deeper and broader understanding. It can change the way we contemplate life, and lichens can lure us into new questions and answers. What is our relationship to the natural world? What are we about? Sheldrake continues, and I'm going to quote, offer you a couple more quotes from Sheldrake. Lichens are places where an organism unravels into an ecosystem and where an ecosystem congeals into an organism. Lichens are stabilized networks of relationships. They never stop lichenizing. They are verbs as well as nouns. And here's a copy of his new book. It's great, by the way. So I'd like to think of lichens as models of symbioses and ecosystems in both material and spiritual ways, symbiont diversity and flexibility, and thus reciprocal interactions, reciprocity, the giving and taking among the symbionts. Through numerous ecological interactions, lichens sustain humans like me, but humans have not worked at sustaining lichens, either directly or indirectly. In some places and under some circumstances, lichens, as tough as they are ironically very sensitive to environmental change, degradation, and pollution, for example, with sulfur dioxide and associated acid rain conditions. It is in this context that I feel profoundly obligated to give back, to actively engage in the network of the natural world by not only taking, but also offering my time and energy to help the environment realize its potential for biodiversity and functioning. So the last of my stories has to do with giving back. Ecological resilience is defined as the capacity of a system to deal with change and to continue to adapt. And in finding new ways of thinking about restoration ecology that go beyond just recreating prior reference conditions and rather seek to restore and maintain ecological processes that support resistance, recovery, and reorganization. Specifically, I'm working at ecological resilience at the college's field stations, using prescribed burns and restoration to savanna-type habitat. The college owns and manages 3 field stations, and here are 2 of them. Greenwing Environmental Laboratory, like Kai said, is located in north central Illinois, and Collinson Ecological Preserve is just down the road in Milan, Illinois. So I'd like to share with you some of the restoration activities that I've been involved with at the field stations recently. Here is a prescribed burn here's a burn crew up here, and I'm in this photo somewhere. In fact, there I am right down here, participating in this burn. And it's listed as at Grimmel Wildlife Sanctuary. Grimmel Wildlife Sanctuary is actually right next to our field station, so we actually collaborate a lot on our management activities, including prescribed burns like this. So here's a burn that we did on the 22nd of March in 2021. So this is an aerial photograph of our field station. It's 15 acres. It's basically a rectangle. The red area that I've shaded here is where we did the burning. Here's a photograph, a before and after photograph of the burn, just to give you some perspective. Here is our green wing meadow at our field station. This is on the 21st of March before the burn. And then after the burn, I went back and did this after photograph to just show you the burn effect. So this paper in part guides the work that we do at the field stations, and it is published by authors of Gilson et al., and it's titled Resilience and Fire Management in the Anthropocene. So the principles for building resilience are listed here. Basically, there are 2 principles that I've summarized from this paper that are applicable to our field stations: maintaining biodiversity and redundancy of local habitat patches within landscapes, and then managing connectivity of habitat. So it's important not to burn everything all at once and all the patches that we can burn in an area, to do it sequentially, to give time for those patches to recover, and those patches can serve as sources for biodiversity to colonize places that are burned recently. So this is our approach, basically our approach. Here is transitioning now to Collinson. So this is in Milan. The top map shows the site boundaries right here. We burn at this site as well, and this is the small little habitats known as hill prairie habitat that we actively manage. This is actually a state nature preserve, and so we co-manage this with heritage biologists from the department from DNR. And these are brand new aerial photographs that were taken by a friend who just got a drone. And this is so close to the Moline Airport that a lot of people don't get access or permission to even fly drones because of the flight paths of the planes coming into and out of the Moline Airport. But he did get clearance to fly his new drone, so this is a nice view of our hill prairies right here, showing you the forest boundary as well. So the site is composed not just of hill prairies, but mostly of forest and deciduous upland forest. But in our surveys, our plant surveys and wildlife surveys through the site, it sure looks like ridge tops and west to southwest facing slopes suggest that there was savanna habitat there. That's to say, more open habitat with widely scattered trees and more savanna-type plants in between those trees. The plants that, well, here's a list of the plants that we believe are indicators of prior savanna habitat. So this is guiding some of our work. And then, since I'm a complete nutcase about birds, I've documented birds extensively there, and it's just been so nice to see so many red-headed woodpeckers at Collinson Ecological Preserve. Red-headed woodpeckers as a species has just plummeted in numbers through time, mostly because of habitat loss. They are specialists of savanna habitat. So the fact that they're there suggests that there is at least some savanna that they're benefiting from, and we're going to try to restore a little bit more of it. Here is a map of the site again, and our focus area at Collinson of this restoration work is found here, shaded in various colors. So we're managing woodland areas to provide, we're managing woodland areas by the reduction of mesophyte species, that's to say those wet-loving species. We want to be drier and more savanna-like, and encouraging hotter prescribed fires. And so to do that, we are actively seeding the site in various places with a vegetation that really burns well in a prescribed burn. And so we purchased a lot of Virginia rye, and we are sifting it out here in the bed of a truck. And then my friends and I are prepping the forest floor to then broadcast that seed. And the seed has germinated. There's lots of new Virginia rye growing. We have plans next week, weather permitting, to actually do a burn out there and see how that goes in terms of our management activities. So the goal of this work is to maintain and manage biodiversity and connectivity that would allow fire-prone areas to realize high levels of resilience in the face of change. But mostly, engaging in this work is my way of giving back because I take so much from the natural world. Just like to say thank you very much for letting me share with you some stories and photographs of survivor sycamore, the tufted titmouse, and lichens. These and other stories and photos were inspired and informed by the natural world through the lenses of the Tibetan mandala and Humboldt's Cosmos and other nature writers and artists. In Cosmos, Humboldt wrote, "Thus in the sphere of natural investigation, as in poetry and painting, the delineation of that which appeals most strongly to the imagination derives its collective interest from the vivid truthfulness with which the individual features are portrayed." Thank you very much.
Are you okay with a couple of questions?
Sure, I can address some questions, yes.
Can you re-explain it in simple terms? If you want the green trees, things to be there, why are you doing berms? I don't get it.
Could you repeat the question, please? Sir?
I will,
Yeah,
absolutely.
thank
Yep.
you.
So here is an aerial photograph of one part of our Collinson field station. And I put this up here to provide, so the question is, why are we burning the site? And
Well, if you want the trees to be there, why are you burning?
if we want the trees to be there, why are we burning? We don't want, in some places that are like facing the west and southwest, that's getting blasted by the sun, the forest is actually too dense. There's too many trees, and it's changing the look and the feel and the way the area operates. And there are species out there that are still sort of hanging around in these sort of wet areas with very dense trees, lots of trees there. There's some species, like I show in this list right here, that suggest the place was once not so dense. So we still want trees there, but we want trees like they're listed here. Are they listed? Yeah, black oak, hickory. We want those trees to be more widely scattered. And we want other sorts of forbs to come up and grow on the forest floor. Only because we could keep things status quo. We don't have to change anything. But the fact that the red-headed woodpecker is there and these savanna-type species suggests savanna was there before, and maybe the region would benefit from more savanna habitat, for sure. Okay.
Whatever works.
Yeah, so, but that's only in certain places. Let me go back here. So, for instance, I don't know if you can get a feel from this graphic right here, but this is a west-southwest facing slope that should be very dry in savanna, and it's not. It's very wet and very dense with trees. And we want to see if we transition that back to savanna, how the system will work. Is that the way it should truly be? It's actually kind of an experiment in progress. Yes?
Yeah. So, do you, of the trees that are coming up that you don't want there, are you finding exotics like burning bush, which is so endemic at Black Hawk State Historic Site, which is a forest, which is a nature conservancy, and actually has to have permission to go in there, but it's so close to people's yards who have burning bush that it has become a problem. So, because of birds flying in with it. So are birds flying in with exotic trees here that you don't want?
Exactly. And that's one of the side effects. I guess that's one of the side goals that we have with this management, is to try and get those invasive species more at bay. I don't think we can ever control it. We definitely have burning bush out there, but boy, if you could walk that site, actually you can walk that site if you want, because of your husband there. As an alum, but you are an alum, right?
They're both
Yeah.
alums.
Yeah, both
He's
alums,
emeritus.
absolutely.
He's emeritus.
Yes, and so you can walk that site and see we've controlled burning bush really well, but we have had a hard time controlling is Oriental bittersweet. I don't know if you've heard of Oriental bittersweet. That's a huge problem, and the more wet areas with very dense trees is just supporting that invasive species very, very well.
Locusts probably too.
Not so much locusts. One of our alums, his name is Rob Leva. He's a regional environmental consultant. He's like my land manager, and he has done such an amazing job at controlling so much of the invasive plants out there. Kudos to him and his ongoing efforts. He's out there, I think, right now doing work. So yes, that's part of the exotics. Any other questions? Yes.
Just an observation. The controlled burns, they really are human interference or a way to kind of control things. When did all of this start, that this was attempted to see what would happen?
At Collinson or just in general
Just
in
in
the field?
general.
Yeah, I am so sorry. I don't know the historical context of that. When I moved here, actually just a couple years after this lecture series started, this management technique has been ongoing and people have been using it for a number of years. Maybe Kai knows.
Well, I can tell you a little bit from the perspective of the Forest Preserve District here in Rock Island County. We're actually emulating nature. So we have these invasive species that come in. Evolution did not equip them to survive a wildfire. Our native species that proliferated across the prairies evolved to survive wildfire, which is a natural phenomenon. So when they burn down, the seed pods of our native species know how to outwit fire. And the next growing season, they come back. What doesn't come back are the invasive species. So a great colleague named Mike Peterson at Illinois Park, and then Ben Mills at Loud Thunder, this is nothing new It's just our ability to harness it has gotten better and better and better. So again, Black Hawk State Historic Site, if you're driving through that lovely stretch of road, you can see right there on the south side where there was a burn. What's coming back has almost none of the invasive species. So when you do a prairie restoration, there is a rhythm. You go through several years to make sure that everything's going like crazy. We're doing one at Augie right now. And then after a certain amount of time, so this burn is not, I think, it could be viewed as human interference, or it might be viewed as humans emulating a natural process that had been interrupted. Would that be
Well
supportive?
said. No, exactly. It's well said. The ecological context is absolutely there in terms of the forest that you see up there being adapted to fire. Occasional fire. Occasional. And we're trying to emulate the periodicity, you know, the intervals of doing fires. I mean, people have demonstrated in recent research that fires kill a lot of things that you don't want killed. But if you do it, as I mentioned before, that's why I try to explain the rationale for what we're doing, and that is to create resilience. Because we're not only dealing with invasive species in the current situation as it is, we're trying to prepare for the future and climate change. And so we're trying to increase resilience in the organisms there. Not just through fire, through other ways of management.
So invasive species, have any of those ever been studied just to see if there are any benefits to them?
Well, yeah, so yes, and there is a burgeoning school of thought, you mentioned climate change, that the climate here in 100 years will be very different than what it was 100 years ago. So it may be that native species, and this is where we have intervened in natural processes, we've accelerated climate change. That we may see that simply replanting the species that were native here 100 years ago, they may not be the most resilient. We may need to look to other forms from other ecosystems. It's all very delicate, but the intent is to try to be thoughtful.
And we're not just using fire. I mentioned Rob Leva, who's my land manager. He has spent a good part of the summer with one of the people that he employs, collecting native seeds of sunflowers and other types of prairie plants and forest plants from in the region. We could order these seeds from a nursery up in Minnesota, but the genotypes, the specific kind of local adaptations embedded in the genes of these things from up there may not grow well here. So he has spent a lot of time collecting local things to broadcast and try to grow there, and using fire to enable that process as well.
Maybe time for one more question.
Yeah, so is there a way to get some of those local genotype seeds? I have a hillside that I can attest to the invasive species.
Yeah.
I mean, I dig up greenbrier and it is never ending. I get more and more. I dig a lot of stuff out and it's never ending because something else always comes in and I'm like, how the heck does this get there? But it does.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So what's your question again?
Well, so my question was more of a comment, but
Okay.
then also, is there a place where I can get some of these local genotype of seeds?
Yeah, I don't know of a place where you can get one, to be
So
honest with you.
for some species, you might want to contact our friends at Living Lands and Waters,
Chadwick, sure.
because a lot of the fundraising he does is to get massive amounts of plants and trees like black oak. Black oak used to proliferate much more in this region than it does now because it couldn't compete with, would you know that red maples are an invasive species? We love them, don't we? Because they look so pretty, but this isn't part of their natural habitat. They grow so quickly that they outcompete the saplings of black oaks and the hickory that you were talking about. So talk to those folks at Living Lands and Water. They might be able to help you.
And please be on the lookout, have on your radar, through Living Lands and Waters and other local conservation groups. I think that there's a new initiative starting in the Quad Cities called the Ravine Institute. And it's partially being supported by one of the emeritus professors in English, Don Erickson from Augustana, as well as Rob Leva and some other people. And that's one of the things that I think they want to do is have a seed bank that they can offer to people, actually. And I offered to Augustana to possibly be part of that greenhouse seed bank area for this place, but it's still very early in the works. But I just throw that out there because the Ravine Institute may be a real thing in the not too distant future, so.
Oh, I just say, we have a seed library here.
Yeah, and there's a seed library at your Rock Island Public Library.
So, yeah.
So we're on a roll here this year's Frieze Lectures that we keep going past time. But the good news is we have coffee and cookies, and if Dr. Hager can hang out for a few minutes, you have time to talk with him there. Please come back. We have one more week, and boy, are we going out with some fireworks. Not only is Dr. Ashley Burge going to be talking about Toni Morrison's Beloved, but afterwards we're having a little party.